Imagine for a moment that the most powerful man in the world is not the one sitting in the Oval Office. Imagine that the real power lies in the shadows of a smoky Chicago nightclub, in the whisper of a deal made over a plate of spaghetti, in the silent language of a loaded gun. This is the story of that man, a king who ruled an invisible empire. His name was Sam Giancana, born Momo Salvatore Giancana, and his life was a tapestry woven with threads of unimaginable wealth, brutal violence, and political secrets so dark they could shatter the very image of American democracy. This narrative, pieced together from countless court documents, FBI wiretaps, and the testimonies of those who lived in his shadow, is presented to you with the sole purpose of delivering a clear, unfiltered account of a truth that is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us journey back to a time when a mobster's hand, stained with blood and money, reached into the highest echelons of power and helped to steer the course of history. The story begins not in the opulent halls of power, but in the gritty, desperate streets of Chicago's Little Italy, a world of tenements and tough luck, where a young boy learned his first and most crucial lesson, that the world was divided into those who were prey and those who were predators. It was here, in this cauldron of immigrant ambition and poverty, that Momo Giancana decided he would never be prey. He was a small, wary boy with eyes that held a chilling absence of fear, a quality that immediately set him apart from the other children. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, his education shifting from the classroom to the alleyways, where he learned the arithmetic of survival. How much a stolen apple cost, how much a well-placed threat was worth, and how loyalty in his world was a currency more valuable than gold. He quickly became the leader of a street gang known as the 42 Gang, a collection of wild, fearless teenagers who specialized in theft, burglary, and intimidation. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency and, more importantly, their silence in the face of police interrogation caught the attention of the very men who ruled the Chicago underworld, the successors to Al Capone's empire. They saw in young Momo a raw, untamed potential, a natural killer, and a shrewd strategist. He was recruited into the Chicago outfit, and his rise was as meteoric as it was brutal. He earned his bones, as they said, through acts of calculated violence that became the stuff of legend within the organization. He was not a loud, flashy gangster. He was quiet, methodical, and utterly ruthless. His signature was a .38 caliber pistol, and his business card was the fear he instilled in the hearts of his enemies. He understood that power was not just about pulling the trigger, but about making everyone believe you were willing to do it without a second thought. He rose through the ranks during the turbulent era of Prohibition, a time when the outfit's fortunes were built on bootlegging, but his true genius lay in diversification. As the nation emerged from the Great Depression and into the post-war boom, Giancana, now known as Sam to his associates, saw the future. He pushed the outfit into new, lucrative ventures, control of the unions, specifically the powerful Teamsters, which gave him the ability to paralyze the city with a single phone call. The racketeering of legitimate businesses through a technique called the juice loan, where exorbitant interest rates were enforced with baseball bats and blowtorches, and the expansion of gambling and prostitution rings across the country. But his most ambitious project was Las Vegas. He, along with his associates, understood that the gleaming casinos in the Nevada desert were money-making machines, and they used the Teamsters' massive pension fund to finance the construction of iconic casinos, skimming millions of dollars from the counting rooms before the money ever hit the books, a river of untaxed, untraceable cash that flowed directly back to Chicago. By the mid-1950s, Sam Giancana was the undisputed boss of the Chicago outfit, a man of immense power and paranoia. He lived in a heavily guarded mansion in the suburb of Oak Park, a symbol of his paradoxical existence, a kingpin seeking the respectability of suburban life while his empire thrived on its darkest impulses. He was a fixture at the Armory Lounge, a club in Forest Park that served as his unofficial headquarters, where he would hold court, surrounded by sycophants and soldiers, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. It was from this position of immense, shadowy power that he would embark on his most audacious and dangerous enterprise, one that would take him from the back rooms of Chicago to the very heart of the American political system, an alliance with the CIA that would blur the lines between national security and organized crime forever, setting the stage for a betrayal that would echo through history and ultimately lead to a violent end in a basement, a final, bloody punctuation to a life lived entirely on his own terms. The world of Sam Giancana was a fortress built on cash and fear, but even the most formidable fortresses have a back door, and for the Chicago outfit, that door was opened by the United States government itself. The year was 1960, and the Cold War was a pervasive chill seeping into every corner of American policy. In Cuba, a revolutionary named Fidel Castro had seized power and, to the horror of Washington, had begun to openly align himself with the Soviet Union. This was more than a political problem. It was a direct financial catastrophe for the American underworld. Before Castro, Havana had been a glittering, wide-open city, a playground owned and operated by the mob. Meyer Lansky, Santo Traficante Jr., and Sam Giancana himself had millions of dollars invested in casinos, hotels, and nightclubs, all of which were now confiscated by the new communist regime. The mob wanted their paradise back, and the CIA wanted a communist thorn removed from the hemisphere's side. It was in this volatile climate of shared interest that a deal with the devil was not just considered, it was actively pursued. The CIA, through a series of intermediaries, reached out to the one organization they believed had the means and the motivation to accomplish what their own agents could not: assassinate Fidel Castro. The agency's logic was chillingly pragmatic. Who better to kill a foreign leader than men who were professional killers, men who operated outside the law, men whose actions could be disavowed by the government with a simple, clean denial? And so, a secret alliance was born, an unholy matrimony between America's premier intelligence agency and the nation's most powerful crime syndicates. Sam Giancana, with his extensive connections in Cuba and his burning desire to reclaim his lucrative empire, was a central figure in these plots from the very beginning. He did not see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a patriot and a businessman, solving a problem for a client, with the client being his own country. The schemes, hatched in this clandestine partnership, were as bizarre as they were sinister. The CIA's Technical Operations Division, working with mobsters like Giancana and Johnny Roselli, devised a series of increasingly outlandish assassination methods. They plotted to poison Castro with botulinum toxin, a deadly biological agent, pills that were to be slipped into his food or drink. Giancana, with a gangster's dark humor, even suggested a more personal touch, proposing that the pills be hidden in a box of his favorite cigars. There were plans for an exploding seashell, placed in a location where Castro loved to snorkel. There were schemes involving contaminated diving suits and poisoned pens. Through it all, Giancana was an eager, almost boastful participant. He saw this collaboration as the ultimate validation of his power, proof that he was not just a hoodlum, but a player on the world stage. A man whose skills were so indispensable that the government itself had to come knocking. This arrogance was amplified by his relationship with another powerful figure, a man whose rise to the highest office in the land would become inextricably linked with Giancana's own destiny, Senator John F. Kennedy. The connection ran through the bustling, politically volatile city of Chicago, and through a man who knew the secrets of both the political and the criminal worlds, Frank Sinatra. Old Blue Eyes was more than a singer. He was a conduit, a glamorous bridge between the bright lights of celebrity and the shadowy back rooms of power. Sinatra introduced John F. Kennedy to Sam Giancana, and more importantly, he introduced Kennedy to Giancana's formidable political machine. The 1960 presidential election was razor thin, and Illinois, with its notoriously corrupt electoral system, was a key battleground state. Giancana, the undisputed master of Chicago, could deliver votes. He controlled the unions, the precinct captains, and the men who counted the ballots. It was whispered, and later investigated, that the outfit poured massive sums of money into the campaign and employed its signature tactics of intimidation to ensure a favorable outcome. The quid pro quo was never explicitly stated, but it hung in the air, a silent understanding. The mob had helped put a president in the White House, and they expected a certain leniency in return. A blind eye turned towards their operations, perhaps, or a more aggressive stance against Castro. For Giancana, it was the pinnacle of his influence. He had helped to elect a president while simultaneously working with the CIA to topple a foreign leader. He was, in his own mind, the puppet master, pulling the strings of power from his booth at the Armory Lounge. He had no way of knowing that this dizzying ascent into the stratosphere of geopolitical intrigue was also the beginning of his most precipitous fall. That the very president he helped to power would soon become his most dangerous enemy, setting in motion a chain of events fueled by betrayal and revenge that would culminate in a tragedy in Dallas and, ultimately, in a bloody and lonely end for the mob boss himself, a final, brutal lesson in the fact that in the high-stakes game he was playing, there were no permanent allies, only permanent interests. The intoxicating sense of power that Sam Giancana felt in the wake of John F. Kennedy's electoral victory was, like all things in his world, built on a foundation of shifting sand, a mirage that would soon dissolve into a desert of betrayal and rage. The first cracks appeared not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical appointment of the president's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, to the post of Attorney General. For Giancana, this was not just a political decision. It was a deeply personal affront, a declaration of war from the very family he believed was indebted to him. Bobby Kennedy was not like other government officials who could be bribed, intimidated, or reasoned with. He was a crusader, a man possessed by a fervent moral conviction to dismantle organized crime in America. And he saw the Chicago outfit not as a business to be regulated, but as a cancer to be cut out under his leadership. The Department of Justice was transformed into a relentless machine, aimed directly at the heart of Giancana's empire. Wiretaps, which had once been an occasional nuisance, became a constant, humming presence in his life. FBI agents, once easily eluded or paid off, became shadows he could not shake. Their unmarked cars parked outside his home, their notebooks documenting his every move. His phones, his favorite booths at his clubs, even the homes of his mistresses, were no longer safe. The pressure was immense and unceasing. This was the great betrayal, the unpaid debt that festered in Giancana's mind, turning from professional frustration into a venomous personal hatred. He had delivered Illinois. He had used his influence to help put Jack Kennedy in the White House, and in return, he got not a grateful ally, but a zealous prosecutor who was determined to see him behind bars. The irony was bitter and inescapable. While one part of the government, the CIA, was secretly enlisting his help to kill a foreign leader, another part, the Justice Department, was using every resource at its disposal to destroy him. This duality defined the chaos of his existence. In one breath, he was a valued, if deniable, asset to national security. In the next, he was public enemy number one. The Castro plots, which had once been a source of pride and a testament to his reach, now became a tangled web of paranoia. The poison pills failed, the exploding seashell was never deployed, and Castro remained, a mocking symbol of Giancana's impotence. As Robert Kennedy's investigation intensified, Giancana began to suspect a darker, more horrifying possibility that the entire CIA collaboration had been a setup, an elaborate ruse to keep him occupied and compromised while the administration tightened the noose around his neck. His fury knew no bounds. He felt used, discarded, and humiliated. It was in this cauldron of white, hot anger that the most sinister and persistent rumor of the 20th century was born, a whisper that would grow into a roar and forever link the name Sam Giancana to the single most traumatic event in modern American history: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The official story, the Warren Commission report, would point to a lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald, but a parallel narrative fueled by motive, opportunity, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence would suggest a conspiracy. And at the center of that conspiracy sat the betrayed and vengeful mob boss. The logic was chillingly simple. Giancana had the motive, a seething hatred for the Kennedy brothers. He had the means, a nationwide network of professional killers, and the logistical capability to plan and execute a complex operation. And he had the opportunity through his associates like Johnny Roselli. He had deep connections to the underworld of Dallas and New Orleans, the very cities that formed the backdrop of the assassination. The theory posits that the mob, in conjunction with disgruntled CIA elements who were also enraged by Kennedy's perceived failures after the Bay of Pigs invasion, orchestrated the murder and used Oswald as a patsy, a fall guy to take the blame. Was Sam Giancana in a room, pointing at a map of Dealey Plaza, giving the order? It is unlikely, and there has never been any concrete, irrefutable evidence to prove it. But did his rage, his influence, and his connections create an atmosphere where such an act could be conceived and set into motion? That is a question that has haunted investigators and historians for decades. What is known is that after November 25, 1963, the world changed for everyone, but for Sam Giancana, it changed in a particularly profound way. The relentless pressure from Robert Kennedy's Justice Department did not disappear with the president's death. If anything, it intensified, as if the Attorney General was now pursuing his brother's killers with a renewed, almost holy vengeance. Giancana found himself trapped, a king in a cage of his own making, his power diminishing with each passing day, his empire under siege, his name forever whispered in the same breath as a national tragedy, a man who had reached for the sun and was now burning in its unforgiving light, his descent into the abyss now inevitable, a slow, painful unraveling that would lead him from the pinnacle of power to a final, shocking confrontation in the one place he had always believed was his sanctuary, his home. The decade that followed the assassination of President Kennedy was for Sam Giancana a slow, agonizing descent from absolute power into a gilded cage of paranoia and irrelevance. A king besieged in his own castle, watching the walls of his empire crumble one brick at a time. The once untouchable boss of the Chicago outfit found himself navigating a new and hostile world. A world where his every move was documented by an army of federal agents, where his old allies grew wary, and where the shadow of Dallas loomed over every conversation. Robert Kennedy, though he would leave the Justice Department in 1964 to become a senator, had set in motion a legal machine that would not stop, its gears turning with a relentless, impersonal efficiency. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's direct command, intensified its surveillance, its agents becoming a permanent feature of Giancana's life, so ubiquitous that they were almost a part of his entourage, a silent, scribbling audience to his diminishing reign. He was arrested again and again on charges ranging from contempt of court for refusing to testify before grand juries to more serious conspiracy indictments. The legal battles were a constant drain on his resources and his spirit. a war of attrition that the government was perfectly designed to win. Each court appearance was a humiliation, a public spectacle where the mighty Mooney was forced to sit silently, while prosecutors painted him as a common thug. He spent a significant portion of the late 1960s either fighting cases or in prison. Most notably a term at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, where he was just another inmate number, a profound indignity for a man who had dined with senators and plotted with spies. The world outside was changing. 2. The old codes of silence, the omerty that had once been the bedrock of his organization, were beginning to erode. The new generation of mobsters lacked the discipline and the fear of the old guard. They were flashier, more reckless, and most dangerously, more willing to talk to save their own skins. The trusted circle around Giancana grew smaller and more suspicious. He could feel the foundations of his authority cracking, his commands questioned in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The flow of money, that lifeblood of his power, began to slow to a trickle as his prolonged absences and the intense federal scrutiny made it nearly impossible to effectively manage his vast criminal enterprises. His solution, in a move born of sheer desperation and a fading grip on reality, was to flee. In 1974, after yet another legal defeat, and facing the prospect of more years behind bars, Sam Giancana did the unthinkable for a man of his stature. He went into exile. He chose not a hideout in the American wilderness, but a luxurious villa in Cuernavaca, Mexico, a beautiful and tranquil town known as the City of Eternal Spring. It was a stunning admission of defeat. The boss who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist was now a fugitive, living off his hidden savings. Surrounded by tropical beauty, but utterly isolated from the source of his power. His days were spent in a strange, sun-drenched purgatory. He would hold court by the pool, attended by a few loyal retainers and his long-time girlfriend, Antoinette. But the men who came to see him were no longer the powerful Capos seeking his blessing on major scores. They were messengers delivering news of a kingdom he could no longer control. The phone lines to Chicago, once buzzing with a dozen deals an hour, were now mostly silent, or worse, he suspected, tapped by both the FBI and his own treacherous subordinates. He tried to maintain a facade of control, issuing orders and making plans for his return, but they were the edicts of a ghost. Echoing in a room that had long since emptied, it was during this period of exile that a new and terrifying thought began to take root in his mind, a suspicion that grew with each passing, lonely day. He began to believe that his own people, the very men he had raised from the streets, the men he had made rich and powerful, had turned against him. He was no longer an asset to the outfit. He was a liability. He knew too much. He knew the secrets of the Castro plots, the details of the Kennedy election, the inner workings of the Vegas scheme, and most dangerously of all, he knew what he knew about Dallas. In the cold, calculating logic of the syndicate he had helped build, a boss in his position, weakened, exiled, and possessed of catastrophic knowledge, was not a king to be restored. He was a problem to be eliminated. The paranoia that had once been a professional tool for survival became his constant companion, a gnawing fear that colored every interaction, every phone call, every unexpected visitor. The eternal spring of Cuernavaca could not warm the chill that had settled in his bones. He was a man waiting for a knock on the door, a man reading betrayal in the eyes of his few remaining friends, a living legend who had become a ghost in his own life, pacing the tiles of his beautiful prison, sensing the inevitable approach of an end that would not be peaceful, an end that would be as brutal and direct as the life he had lived, a final, bloody transaction in the ledger of the outfit, a debt that could only be paid in the currency he understood bestie, violence. The end, when it finally came on the warm evening of June 1975, was not a dramatic, Hollywood-style shootout with screaming sirens and blazing guns, but a quiet, domestic, and profoundly intimate act of betrayal that perfectly encapsulated the brutal pragmatism of the world Sam Giancana had mastered and was now being consumed by. He had returned to his modest, secured house in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park, a decision born of a complex mix of bravado, loneliness, and a desperate desire to reassert some control over his crumbling life. The United States government, in the form of the Senate Intelligence Committee led by Senator Frank Church, was now officially investigating the very shadows Giancana had inhabited for decades. The CIA, Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was scheduled to testify, to sit in a public hearing under the glare of television lights and tell the world what he knew about poison pills and presidential elections. For the current powers in the Chicago outfit, for the men who had taken his place, this was the ultimate and unforgivable sin. A boss, even a former boss, did not testify. A boss did not break omert. A boss carried his secrets to the grave. And so, on that night, the machinery of the syndicate, which Giancana himself had oiled and perfected for decades, was turned against him with chilling efficiency. The killer, or killers, were not strangers. They were almost certainly men he knew, men he had broken bread with, men he may have even called friends. This was the key to the entire operation, the reason his sophisticated security system, the cameras, the locks, the reinforced doors, proved utterly useless. Trust was his only real security, and that had been revoked. The scene inside 1147 South Winona Avenue was one of mundane domesticity turned into a chilling crime scene. He was in the basement, a place of utility and storage, standing at the stove, frying sausages and escarole for a late night meal, a simple, solitary act of an old man making his dinner. He was wearing a white tee, shirt and dress slacks, a towel draped over his shoulder. There was no struggle, no forced entry, no sign of a fight. He had turned his back to his guest, a fatal error in a life defined by never making such errors. The weapon was a .22 caliber pistol, a tool of assassins, not soldiers. It was a gun chosen for its low report, its ability to be silenced, and its close range lethality. The killer fired 7 times. The first shot was to the back of the head, at the base of the skull, a classic, professional executioner's shot, designed to sever the brain stem and cause instant, silent death. The 6 other shots were fired into his mouth and jaw, a savage overkill that sent a message far beyond the simple act of murder. In the language of the mob, this was a whack job, a punishment for an informer, for someone who was about to talk. The bullets to the face were a posthumous accusation, a permanent disfigurement declaring him a rat. He fell to the floor in a pool of his own blood. The sizzling of the sausages on the stove, the only witness to his final moments. The scene discovered by police hours later was a tableau of profound contradictions. The ordinary setting of a suburban basement, the simple meal prepared for one, and the grotesque, violent end of a man who had once commanded a nation of criminals. The investigation that followed was, perhaps predictably, a masterpiece of obfuscation. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. The murder weapon was never found, despite numerous theories and named suspects, from rival mobsters like Tony Accardo to his own proteges who feared his testimony. No one was ever formally charged with the murder of Sam Giancana. It was the perfect crime, committed against the most imperfect of victims. His funeral was a spectacle of the world he left behind, a mix of genuine grief and stark hypocrisy. He was laid to rest in a lavish, 12,000 bronze casket, a king's ransom for a king of the underworld. The mourners included a who's who of American organized crime, their faces grim and unreadable behind dark sunglasses, alongside show business personalities like Phyllis McGuire, a reminder of his glamorous connections. They buried him with honor in a mausoleum at Mount Carmel Cemetery, not far from the final resting places of Al Capone and other Chicago mob legends, a permanent resident in the city of the dead he had helped to populate. But the honor was a facade. In death, as in his final years of life, Sam Giancana was alone, a symbol of the ultimate truth of his profession. That the power he had spent a lifetime building was an illusion, that the loyalty he demanded was a transaction, and that the violence he had dispensed so freely would, in the end, always find its way back to its source. He was a man who had reached for the stars and grasped only the darkness between them. His legacy, not one of glory, but a cautionary tale written in blood and buried in silence, a final, chilling lesson in the price of power. The silence that followed the 7 gunshots in that Oak Park basement was not merely an absence of sound. It was an active, consuming force that rushed in to fill the void left by Sam Giancana's tumultuous life, a silence enforced by fear, sealed by Omert, and perpetuated by the cold, institutional inertia of multiple powerful entities who found it far more convenient to let the story of the murdered mob boss fade into obscurity than to confront the terrifying truths his testimony might have unleashed. The official investigation into his death, conducted by the Oak Park Police with the assistance of the FBI, moved with a lethargy that many observers found suspicious. A stark contrast to the relentless energy those same agencies had once devoted to hunting the man when he was alive. Leads that seemed promising evaporated. Witnesses with potential information developed sudden. Profound amnesia. The intricate web of Giancana's associations, which the government had spent decades meticulously mapping, suddenly became an impenetrable fog. It was as if a secret, unspoken consensus had been reached from the highest levels of the Chicago outfit to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Some doors, once opened, could lead to a labyrinth from which there was no return, and the door labeled Sam Giancana was best welded shut forever. The Senate Intelligence Committee, which had so eagerly subpoenaed him, now found its most crucial witness permanently silenced, a fact that effectively neutered its investigation into the CIA Mafia plots. They could interview other figures, like Johnny Roselli, who would later himself be murdered and found stuffed in an oil drum floating in Biscayne Bay. But they could never hear the full, unvarnished account from the Chicago boss who had been at the very heart of the conspiracy. Giancana's death ensured that the official record would remain fragmentary, a collection of tantalizing hints and deniable connections, but never a complete, corroborated narrative. This was his final, paradoxical service to the institutions he had both served and subverted in death. He maintained the secret history he had helped to write. For his family, particularly his daughters, the silence was a different kind of torment, a lifelong sentence of unanswered questions and a gnawing sense of injustice. They were left to navigate the wreckage of his legacy, burdened by a famous name synonymous with crime and murder. Forever forced to defend a ghost they could neither fully defend nor completely disown. They lived with the constant, haunting suspicion that the men who killed their father were not just faceless monsters from the underworld, but men who had sat at their dinner table, men who had patted them on the head as children, men who had smiled and called their father friend. This intimate betrayal poisoned their memories and cast a perpetual shadow over their lives, a reminder that the world their father built was one where love and loyalty were always conditional, always secondary to the brutal calculus of power. In the years that followed, the legend of Sam Giancana began to ossify, transforming from a living, breathing man of immense complexity into a two-dimensional archetype, a stock character in the sprawling mythology of the American Mafia. He became the Mafia kingpin in history books, shadowy boss in television documentaries, a figure defined more by his alleged connection to the Kennedy assassination than by the intricate, decades-long criminal empire he had actually constructed. The real Sam Giancana, the shrewd, paranoid, and fiercely intelligent strategist who understood the mechanics of power better than most senators, was slowly erased, replaced by a simpler, more marketable villain. His story became a cautionary tale, but often for the wrong reasons. The lesson was not about the corrosive nature of absolute power or the fatal dangers of mixing crime and politics, or the personal tragedy of a man who sacrificed everything for a throne that ultimately consumed him. The simplified lesson became cross the mob, and you will end up dead. This reduction dishonored the profound complexity of his rise and fall. The true legacy of Sam Giancana is not found in the gruesome crime scene photos from his basement, but in the unsettling questions his life forces us to ask about the nature of American power. He was a living embodiment of the interface between the legitimate and the illegitimate, a proof of concept that the two worlds are not separate spheres, but deeply intertwined, sharing the same players, the same ambitions, and sometimes the same dark secrets. His story challenges the comforting narrative of a clear line between good and evil, between the government and the criminals. He was a man who helped make a president and may have had a hand in killing one, a man who was simultaneously hunted by the Justice Department and hired by the CIA. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the smooth functioning of our political and intelligence systems has occasionally, and perhaps necessarily, relied on bargains made with monsters, and that the price of those bargains is a debt that is sometimes paid in blood and silence, a silence that continues to echo through the decades, a quiet but persistent hum beneath the official history of the United States, a reminder that the full story of the 20th century remains, in some crucial aspects, stubbornly, deliberately, and perhaps permanently untold. To truly understand the enigmatic and terrifying figure of Sam Giancana, one must venture beyond the headlines of conspiracy and murder and delve into the very psyche of the man, into the intricate machinery of his mind that allowed him to ascend from the squalor of the Little Italy slums to a position where he could confidently negotiate with spies and sway presidential elections, a journey that reveals a character far more complex and chilling than the simple thug he was often portrayed as. The foundation of his power was not built on brute force alone, though he wielded that with ruthless efficiency, but on a preternatural understanding of human weakness, a cold, analytical ability to identify what a man truly desired, be it money, power, sex, or security, and then to present himself as the sole, indispensable conduit to that desire. He was a master of leverage, a grand puppeteer who understood that the strings controlling men were not made of fear, but of want. He cultivated an aura of unshakable calm, a quiet, almost monastic stillness that stood in stark contrast to the volatile, hot, tempered gangsters who had preceded him. He spoke softly, his words chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, and he listened with an intensity that made people feel both exposed and strangely valued. This was not a social grace, it was a predatory technique. In the silence between another man's words, Giancana was hunting, listening for the subtle inflections of doubt, the hidden reservoirs of greed, the unspoken fears that could be exploited. He built his empire not just on a network of illegal ventures, but on a vast, intricate web of personal debts and unshakable obligations. He would perform a favor, often unsolicited. A troublesome union leader would suddenly become cooperative. A zoning problem for a new business would mysteriously vanish. A rival would have a sudden change of heart, and then he would wait. The recipient of the favor would be grateful, of course, but beneath the gratitude was the chilling understanding that the debt would be called, and that the currency of repayment would be decided by Giancana alone. This system of manufactured loyalty was far more effective than simple intimidation. A man who is afraid may look for an escape. A man who is indebted is already caught. His paranoia, which would later become a debilitating liability. was initially one of his greatest strengths. He trusted no one completely, not his closest allies, not his mistresses, not even his own family. He operated on the principle that every man had his price, and his life's work was to ensure that the price of betraying Sam Giancana was always higher than any potential reward. This is why the Kennedy betrayal cut so deep. It was not just a political reversal, it was a fundamental violation of his core operating principle. A demonstration that the leverage he thought he held was, in the rarefied air of national politics, illusory. The Kennedy brothers had accepted his help and then, from his perspective, refused to honor the debt, wielding the power of the state itself as their weapon. This sent him into a spiral of rage, not only because it threatened his business, but because it shattered his worldview, proving that there were, in fact, people he could not control, a truth his ego could not accept. His foray into the world of CIA plots, while financially motivated by the loss of Havana, was also driven by this deep-seated need to reassert his relevance on a grand scale, to prove that his particular set of skills were vital to the most powerful nation on earth. He wasn't just a contractor for the CIA, he was a partner, an equal in a world historical endeavor. This inflated self-perception is what made his subsequent fall so dramatic. The failed plots, the relentless persecution by Robert Kennedy, the exile in Mexico, each was a successive blow to his identity as the master manipulator, the unseen power. By the time he returned to Oak Park, he was a ghost of his former self, a lion who had been declawed and caged, yet still possessed of the dangerous knowledge that had built his kingdom. And it was this knowledge, this intimate understanding of the darkest secrets of the American century, that made his continued existence intolerable to the new masters of his empire and to the powerful figures in the shadows who had collaborated with him. His death was not just a mob hit. It was a necessary act of informational hygiene, the closing of a living archive whose contents were too volatile for the public record. To understand Sam Giancana is to understand that his murder was the logical, perhaps even inevitable, conclusion of his own life's philosophy in a world built on secrets and leverage. The man who holds the most dangerous secrets and can no longer enforce his leverage becomes the greatest liability of all, a loose end that must be trimmed, a story that must be ended mid-sentence, leaving only a haunting, eternal silence for the rest of the world to decipher. The world that Sam Giancana constructed and ruled over was a vast, intricate, and darkly mirrored reflection of legitimate society, a parallel economy with its own laws, its own hierarchies, its own system of justice, and its own very distinct concept of honor, all operating just beneath the thin, polished veneer of post-war American prosperity. To walk with Giancana through his kingdom in the 1950s and early 1960s was to witness a shadow nation in full, efficient operation. It began in the gritty streets of the First Ward, where the political machine of Chicago, an entity almost inseparable from the outfit, ensured that friendly aldermen were elected, that police patrols turned a blind eye to certain activities, and that city contracts found their way to certain construction companies, all facilitated by a steady flow of cash from the outfit's coffers. From there, the empire radiated outwards, its tendrils reaching into the most unexpected corners of American life. The labor unions, particularly the Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa, were not just allies. They were a foundational pillar of his power. By controlling the unions, Giancana could guarantee labor peace for businesses that paid him tribute, or he could paralyze entire industries with a strategically called strike, crippling anyone who refused to cooperate. This was power on a macroeconomic scale. The ability to influence the price of goods, the flow of trucking, and the construction of skyscrapers. Then there were the more traditional, but no less sophisticated, criminal enterprises. The sprawling network of illegal gambling that took bets on everything from horse races to political elections, a river of untaxed cash that flowed into the outfit's counting rooms. The prostitution rings that operated out of seemingly respectable hotels and massage parlors, and the juice loans, the high interest lending to businessmen and gamblers who couldn't access traditional banks, loans enforced not by lawsuits, but by the very real and immediate threat of broken bones and shattered lives. But the crown jewel, the symbol of the outfit's audacious reach, was Las Vegas. Giancana, along with figures like Meyer Lansky, saw the potential of the Nevada desert not as a place for vacation, but as the ultimate money-making machine. Through hidden ownership and secret partnerships, the mob financed the construction of iconic casinos like the Sands, the Riviera, and the Desert Inn. The real profit, however, came from the skin. Before the casino winnings were ever counted for tax purposes or entered into the official books, a team of trusted operatives would systematically remove a portion of the cash, usually from the counting rooms, stuffing it into briefcases to be flown directly to Chicago, Kansas City, and New York. This was pure, untraceable profit, millions of dollars every year, that existed outside the gaze of the IRS and the FBI. Money that was used to fund further expansion, bribe public officials, and finance the lavish lifestyles of the bosses. Giancana's personal life was a study in this duality. He lived in a quiet suburb, a family man in a nice house. Yet his home was a fortress with state-of-the-art security systems. He was a devoted father who hosted birthday parties, yet his business meetings often concerned murder and extortion. He was a fixture at the Armory Lounge, his favorite nightclub, where he would hold court in a back booth, surrounded by an entourage of sycophants and soldiers. In this environment, he was the king, a calm, smiling center of a universe of violence. Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack would perform for him. Dean Martin would pour him a drink, and politicians would quietly come to pay their respects. This was the height of his power, the era where the lines between the underworld and the upper world were not just blurred, but often completely erased. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was essential, if hidden, gear in the machine of the city, and by extension, the nation. He understood that true power wasn't about being feared on the street. It was about being necessary in the boardroom and the back room of City Hall. This vast, interconnected system functioned with the smooth efficiency of a major corporation because, at its core, that is exactly what it was, a multinational, multi-billion-dollar criminal corporation that dealt in vice, violence, and influence. And at the helm of this corporation sat Sam Giancana, the quiet, unassuming CEO in a tailored suit, a man who never forgot his humble beginnings on the streets of Little Italy, but who had mastered the art of projecting power from the shadows, a man who, for a brief, dazzling, and terrifying moment in American history, proved that it was possible to build an empire invisible to the public eye, yet so deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation that its collapse would send shockwaves through the very foundations of power, a collapse that began not with a financial loss or a failed drug deal, but with a political betrayal that would unravel everything he had so carefully built, thread by bloody thread. The intricate and ultimately catastrophic relationship between Sam Giancana and the Kennedy dynasty represents one of the most fateful and poorly understood alliances in American history. A dark compact forged in the backrooms of Chicago and Las Vegas that would unravel in a storm of betrayal and vengeance, casting a long and bloody shadow over the 1960s. The connection was brokered by the one man who moved as effortlessly through the world of entertainment as Giancana did through the underworld, Frank Sinatra. Old Blue Eyes was more than a crooner, he was a powerful intermediary, a charismatic fixer who understood the mutual benefits that could be reaped from bringing together the raw, street-level power of the outfit with the glamorous, ascending star of Senator John F. Kennedy. Through Sinatra, Giancana was introduced to Kennedy, and more importantly, he was introduced to Kennedy's father, the formidable Joseph P. Kennedy, a man who understood the practicalities of power in a way that mirrored the mob boss's own worldview. The elder Kennedy was no stranger to the shadowy side of business and politics, and he recognized in Giancana a tool of immense potential. The deal, though never explicitly put into writing, was clear and understood by all parties. The 1960 presidential election was poised on a knife's edge, and Illinois, with its notoriously malleable democratic process, was a critical prize. Giancana's control over the Chicago machine was absolute. He could deliver the votes through a combination of old-fashioned ballot stuffing, strategic voter intimidation, and the generous application of cash to precinct captains and election judges. The outfit's money, funneled through various intermediaries, flowed into the Kennedy campaign coffers, and on election day, Giancana's machinery whirred into action. The result was a victory for Kennedy in Illinois by a miraculously thin margin, a victory that many political observers at the time and since have attributed directly to the mob's intervention. For Giancana, this was the pinnacle of his influence. He had helped to make a president. He had a chit, an unspoken IOU of monumental value. The expectation was a new era of dietenti, an understanding that the relentless federal pressure on his operations would cease, that the Kennedy Justice Department would look the other way. This expectation was not just naive. It was a fundamental miscalculation of the character of the man who would become Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was not his father, and he was not his brother. He was a moralist, a crusader who viewed organized crime not as a necessary evil or a potential ally, but as a virulent poison infecting the nation he loved. His appointment as the nation's top law enforcement officer was, from Giancana's perspective, not just a betrayal, it was an act of war. The wiretaps that had been an occasional nuisance under the previous administration became a constant, humming presence. The FBI surveillance intensified from sporadic to relentless. Giancana could not eat a meal, make a phone call, or meet an associate without feeling the gaze of the federal government. Robert Kennedy's Get Hoffa squad was, in reality, a Get the Mob squad, and Giancana was its prime target. The fury that consumed Giancana was all-consuming. He felt used, humiliated, and foolish. He, the master manipulator, had been outmaneuvered. The debt he was owed would not only not be repaid, the creditor was now trying to destroy him. This personal rage is the crucial, volatile element that fuels the most persistent conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy. The motive is clear and powerful, a deep, vengeful hatred. The means were undeniably at his disposal, a national network of assassins. The opportunity was provided by the complex web of anti-Castro-Cubans and disgruntled CIA agents who also felt betrayed by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. While absolute, irrefutable proof of Giancana's direct involvement may never surface, the logic of the situation is terrifyingly compelling. The mob boss who felt double, crossed by the president, had the means, the motive, and the connections to orchestrate the ultimate revenge. This relationship, which began with a handshake in a Las Vegas suite, thus spiraled into a vortex of suspicion and violence that would claim multiple lives, including, ultimately, Giancana's own. A stark lesson in the dangers of reaching for a level of power where the rules of the street no longer apply, but the stakes become exponentially and fatally higher. The story of Sam Giancana does not conclude with the final, brutal gunshots in his basement or his interment in the cold, marble silence of Mount Carmel Cemetery. Instead, it enters a more complex and enduring phase, transforming from a life lived in blood and shadow into a legacy of unsettling questions that continue to gnaw at the foundations of our understanding of American history. A legacy that forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that the official narrative of the 20th century is, in some crucial aspects, a carefully curated artifact, a palimpsest beneath which darker truths remain stubbornly etched. The silence that followed his death was not merely the silence of the grave, but an active, institutional silence. A collective sigh of relief from the corridors of power in Washington and the paneled backrooms of the Chicago outfit. The most dangerous witness had been eliminated, his testimony forever lost to the Senate Church Committee, which was left to piece together the story of the CIA, Mafia plots from second-hand accounts, and the self-serving testimonies of surviving spy masters. Without Giancana's voice, the full scope and depth of that unholy alliance could never be definitively known, leaving a permanent void in the historical record that has been filled with speculation, theory, and a pervasive cultural suspicion. This suspicion is Giancana's true, lasting impact on the American psyche. He is a central, shadowy figure in the birth of the modern conspiracy theory, a living embodiment of the premise that things are not as they seem, that powerful men in smoke-filled rooms make decisions that shape our world far from the public eye. His alleged involvement in the Kennedy assassination, whether real or imagined, has become a cornerstone of an alternative history, a narrative that refuses to accept the lone gunman theory and instead points to a complex web of motives involving the mob, the intelligence community, and anti-Castro militants. The evidence for his direct involvement is, and will likely always remain, circumstantial, a matter of motive, opportunity, and a web of connections. But the absence of proof is not proof of absence. And it is this frustrating ambiguity that gives the story its enduring power. We are left with a series of haunting, unanswerable questions. Did Sam Giancana give the order to kill a president? Or did he merely possess the knowledge of who did, a knowledge that made him a target? Was his murder a simple, straightforward mob hit to prevent a weakened boss from talking? Or was it a more sophisticated operation to close a file that threatened to expose an even wider conspiracy, one that reached into the highest levels of government? The truth is buried under layers of time, fear, and intentional obfuscation. For his family, this legacy is a lifelong burden, a name that is synonymous with crime and mystery, a past that can never be fully escaped or completely understood. They are left with the ghost of a father who was both a loving parent and a ruthless killer, a man who provided for them through a fortune built on suffering, a contradiction that can never be resolved. For the rest of us, the story of Sam Giancana serves as a dark mirror held up to the American dream. It is a story of immigrant ambition twisted into monstrous form, of intelligence and charisma perverted into the service of violence and greed. It is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the fatal dangers of erasing the lines between crime and statecraft. But most of all, it is a reminder that history is not a clean, well-lit room where every fact is neatly arranged on a shelf. It is a dark forest, full of shadows and echoes, where some paths are deliberately overgrown and some voices are permanently silenced. The life and death of Sam Giancana is one of those silenced voices, a story that can only be told in fragments and whispers, a puzzle with key pieces forever missing, leaving us with only the chilling outline of a truth that may be too dark to ever fully comprehend, a permanent stain on the canvas of the past that reminds us that the price of power is often paid, not just by those who seek it, but by the very idea of truth itself. To dissect the life of Sam Giancana is to undertake more than a mere historical autopsy. It is to engage in a profound examination of the American soul itself, to probe the dark, fertile ground where ambition, opportunity, and morality collide, often with catastrophic results. His story is not an anomaly in the American narrative, but rather a stark, exaggerated embodiment of its core tenets, pushed to their most terrifying logical extreme. The same drive that propelled pioneers westward that built industrial empires from the ground up, that fueled technological revolutions, also coursed through Giancana's veins. But in him, it found expression not in the open marketplace or the frontier, but in the forbidden territories of vice and violence. He was, in his own twisted way, a perverse American entrepreneur, a visionary who saw potential for profit and power where others saw only danger and depravity. He built a corporation, structured it for efficiency, diversified its holdings, and managed its human resources with a chilling pragmatism. He understood the laws of supply and demand, the importance of controlling the means of production, and the critical necessity of eliminating competition. His product was not steel or railroads, but fear, and his market was the inherent weakness and desire of mankind. In this sense, his rise is a dark parody of the self-made man, a figure celebrated in American mythology. He started with nothing, an uneducated boy from a poor immigrant family, and through sheer force of will, intelligence, and ruthlessness, he built an empire. Yet, this parallel forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of success and the price of power. When does ambition become pathology? When does the desire for a better life transform into an insatiable hunger for dominance? Giancana's life suggests that the line is perilously thin, and that the very qualities we often laud, determination, strategic thinking, loyalty to one's own, can, in the absence of a moral compass, become the engines of a monstrous enterprise. His world was a distorted reflection of the American dream, a place where hard work was rewarded. But that work was murder and extortion, where loyalty was valued, but that loyalty was enforced with a gun, where family was everything, but the family business was the destruction of other families. He achieved wealth and influence beyond the wildest dreams of most Americans, but he could never truly enjoy it, could never walk in the sunlight, could never know a moment of genuine peace. His mansion was a gilded cage, his wealth a burden, his power a source of constant paranoia. This is the central, tragic paradox of his existence. He spent his life chasing a version of the American dream that, once caught, proved to be a hollow, empty nightmare. Furthermore, his deep entanglement with the CIA and national politics exposes a foundational hypocrisy at the heart of the modern state, the unsettling reality that the institutions sworn to uphold the law will, when deemed necessary, willingly break it, forming temporary alliances with the very forces they are mandated to destroy. The CIA's collaboration with Giancana was not an aberration. It was a cold, calculated policy decision born from the perceived exigencies of the Cold War. In the fight against communism, any ally was a valid ally. Even a man who represented everything the country was supposedly fighting against. This created a moral quagmire from which there was no easy escape. Giancana, the professional criminal, was suddenly a patriot, a soldier in the shadow war. This sanctioned his violence, inflated his ego, and ultimately contributed to his downfall by convincing him of his own invincibility and indispensability. The lesson here is not simply that Giancana was evil and the government was good, but that in the complex, often murky theater of real, world power, such clear distinctions frequently break down. The state, in its pursuit of security, can become a mirror image of its enemies, adopting their methods and compromising its own principles. Giancana's life stands as a permanent testament to this dangerous symbiosis, a warning that when a nation makes a bargain with the devil, it may win a temporary advantage, but it will always forfeit a piece of its soul and the bill for that transaction, as the subsequent decades of suspicion and conspiracy theories have shown will eventually come due, payable with the currency of public trust and the very integrity of history itself. The final act of Sam Giancana's life, the years of exile in Mexico, and his reluctant return to Oak Park, was not merely a chronological endpoint, but a profound psychological unraveling, a slow motion dissection of a soul that had been forged in violence and was now crumbling under the weight of its own accumulated secrets and betrayals. Imagine the scene in Cuernavaca, a beautiful, sun-drenched villa with bougainvillea spilling over white walls. A tranquil setting that stood in stark, almost cruel contrast to the tempest raging within the man who resided there. This was not a retirement. It was an internal exile, a purgatory of his own making. The once sharp and agile mind, a strategic instrument that had outmaneuvered rivals and built an empire, was now increasingly consumed by a single, corrosive emotion, paranoia. But this was not the healthy, professional paranoia that had once kept him alive. This was a degenerative condition, a cancer of the spirit. Every rustle of the leaves in the garden could be an assassin. Every delayed phone call from Chicago was a sign of his forgotten status. Every friendly smile from a local was a potential mask for a killer sent by his own organization. He was a prisoner of the very fear he had so expertly instilled in others for decades. The power he had wielded was always, ultimately, an illusion, a collective agreement that he was the boss. And now that agreement was being rescinded, and he was left with nothing but the cold, hard reality of his vulnerability. He would sit for hours, staring at the shimmering blue water of the swimming pool. But he wasn't seeing the water. He was replaying a lifetime of decisions, searching for the precise moment where the trajectory of his life had curved from ascent to decline. Was it the handshake with Kennedy? The first meeting with the CIA? The moment he decided to help rig an election, believing the gratitude of a political dynasty was a tangible asset? His thoughts would inevitably circle back to the betrayal, to the Kennedys, the ingratitude that burned in his gut like a physical ulcer. The rage was a constant, low-grade fever, punctuated by moments of white, hot fury when he would read in the newspapers about the continued investigations. The relentless Bobby Kennedy, now a senator, but still a thorn in his side, a ghost he could not exorcise. He was a legend becoming a relic, his name still spoken with respect in certain circles, but increasingly as a figure from the past, a cautionary tale about overreach. The money was still there, of course, flowing in from the Vegas skim and other enterprises, but it had lost its meaning. What good was a fortune you couldn't flaunt, power you couldn't exercise, respect you had to demand from a distance? The return to Oak Park was an act of sheer, stubborn defiance, a desperate and perhaps subconscious attempt to reclaim not just his territory, but his identity. He needed to be back in the city that made him, to walk the same streets, to breathe the same air, to feel the gritty reality of Chicago after the artificial paradise of Mexico. But the Chicago he returned to was not the Chicago he had left. The world had moved on. The new generation of mobsters saw him as a problem, a walking secret, a man whose very existence threatened their future. His home, once a fortress that symbolized his power, now felt like a trap. The high walls and security cameras were no longer a statement of dominance. They were the bars of a cage he had willingly walked back into. The basement, where he would meet his end, became his refuge, the most secure part of the house, a place where he could cook, a simple, solitary pleasure that connected him to his humble beginnings. It was in this basement, amidst the familiar smells of frying sausage and escarole, that the final, brutal punctuation to his story was written. The man who entered his home that night was not just a killer. He was the embodiment of Giancana's own life's work, a product of the system of violence and treachery he had perfected. The 7 bullets were not just rounds of ammunition. They were the physical manifestation of 7 decades of accumulated debt, a debt owed to the countless lives he had ruined, the trust he had broken, the blood he had spilled. His death was not a murder in the conventional sense. It was a repossession. The underworld he had ruled was reclaiming its own, closing its ranks, and silencing a voice that knew too much. The silence that followed in the basement was the true end of Sam Giancana, a silence more absolute than any he had ever known, the final, terrifying reward for a life lived entirely in the shadowy pursuit of power. The investigation into the murder of Sam Giancana, or more accurately, the conspicuous lack of a truly resolutive investigation, stands as a masterclass in the art of intentional obfuscation, a case study in how multiple powerful entities can find a common, unspoken interest in allowing a certain truth to remain forever buried beneath a mound of plausible deniability and manufactured ignorance. From the moment Oak Park police discovered his body in the basement, the case was shrouded in a fog that was as thick as it was convenient. The crime scene itself was a paradox, a perfectly executed professional hit that bore all the classic signatures of a mob assassination. Yet it occurred in one of the most secure private residences in the area, a home equipped with a state of the art security system that had been bypassed with an almost contemptuous ease. This single fact pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The killer was someone Giancana knew, someone he trusted enough to allow into his inner sanctum, someone for whom he would willingly disable his own defenses. The absence of forced entry was more telling than any fingerprint. It was the signature of the true murderer, Betrayal. Yet, this most obvious of leads seemed to lead the official investigation nowhere. Witnesses, who in any other homicide would have been vigorously pursued, suddenly developed profound and unshakable memory loss. Neighbors saw nothing, heard nothing. Associates who had been seen with Giancana in the preceding days provided airtight alibis, their stories corroborated by other upstanding citizens who understood the dire consequences of seeing something they shouldn't. The FBI, which possessed more files on Giancana than any other individual on the planet, files filled with the names of his enemies, his rivals, and his potential successors, seemed to offer little more than a polite, bureaucratic assistance to the local police. It was as if the very government that had hounded him for 2 decades had suddenly lost all interest in the fate of its most notorious quarry. The most promising potential lead, the testimony of his daughter Antoinette, who had spoken to him just hours before his death, ultimately led to a dead end. Her insights and suspicions unable to pierce the wall of silence that had descended over the case. The murder weapon, the .22 caliber pistol, was never found, likely disassembled and scattered across the bottom of the Chicago River, a final offering to the gods of silence. This collective failure to solve the crime was not a failure of competence. It was a testament to the pervasive power of the world Giancana had built. The police were not incompetent. They were simply powerless against a code of silence enforced by the very real threat of death. The FBI was not disinterested. It was likely hamstrung by the fact that pursuing the truth too vigorously might have led them down a path they were not prepared to follow. A path that could have connected dots leading back to the CIA, to the Kennedy assassination, to secrets so dark they were deemed best left in the dark. For the Chicago outfit, a solved murder was a catastrophe. It meant someone would have to be arrested. Someone might talk. A chain reaction of testimony could begin. An unsolved murder, on the other hand, was a perfect crime, a clean break, a message sent and received without a return address. The message was clear: no one is safe. No one is above the law of the outfit, not even the man who once was its law. The death of Sam Giancana was therefore more than the elimination of a liability. It was a ritualistic reaffirmation of the syndicate's ultimate power and its absolute authority to police its own. The case was never officially closed, but it grew cold with an astonishing rapidity. The file eventually relegated to a storage room, a monument to a truth that too many people, in too many positions of power, both legitimate and illegitimate, had a vested interest in keeping hidden. The bullet holes in the basement wall were patched and painted over. The house was sold, and life in Oak Park went on. But the unanswered questions surrounding that night became a permanent part of Giancana's legacy. A ghost that haunts the official record, a silent scream in the archives of American crime, a stark reminder that some stories are not meant to have a neat and tidy ending, because the truth, in its raw and unvarnished form, is sometimes too dangerous to be set free. To truly comprehend the profound symbolism of Sam Giancana's final moments, one must not look at the grand sweep of his life, but instead focus with an almost painful intimacy on the specific, mundane details of that basement scene. For it is in these details that the entire tragic poetry of his existence is contained. Picture him there, an old man in a simple white shirt, a towel slung over his shoulder, standing at the stove in the one place he still considered his sanctuary. The air is thick with the pungent, comforting aroma of frying sausages and bitter escarole, a smell that would have transported him back to the kitchens of his childhood in Little Italy, a world away from the glittering casinos and political backrooms he later commanded. He is cooking a solitary, primal act of self-sustenance, a small island of normalcy in a life that had been anything but normal. In this moment, he is not the fearsome boss of the Chicago outfit. He is just a man, tired and worn, preparing his dinner. This is the ultimate vulnerability, the final stripping away of all the layers of power and armor he had spent a lifetime constructing. He is engaged in an act of creation, of nurturing, even as the forces of destruction are literally at his back. The killer, a man he knows, a man he has allowed into this intimate space, does not confront him. There is no final dramatic exchange, no last words of defiance or pleading. The murder is an act of cowardice and absolute efficiency. The first shot to the base of the skull is the shot of a professional, a clinical termination of a problem. It is instant and silent. But the following 6 shots, fired into his mouth and jaw, are something else entirely. They are not necessary to kill him. They are a message. They are a savage, posthumous act of censorship, a violent erasure of his voice. They are the outfit's way of symbolically ripping out his tongue, of punishing him for the mere potential of speech, for the secrets he held in his mind and might have been about to share with the world. The face, the identity, the very instrument through which he commanded and conspired, is obliterated. This overkill is a ritualistic denunciation, a branding that marks him as an informer in death, a final, cruel twist of the knife in the culture of omerta he had championed. The scene is thus a perfect, horrifying diptych on one side, the simple, human act of cooking a meal, on the other, the brutal, inhuman act of annihilation. The frying pan still sizzles on the stove, a stark, almost surreal contrast to the pooling blood on the floor. The ordinary and the monstrous exist side by side in a single, frozen moment. This was the inescapable contradiction of Sam Giancana's life. A man who craved the respectability of a quiet home and family while his profession was chaos and murder. A man who sought the ultimate power only to find himself at his most powerless in his own home. His death was not a warrior's death. It was an execution, a liquidation of a human asset that had depreciated and become a liability. The basement, that most American of spaces, a place for laundry, for storage, for hobbies, was transformed into a slaughterhouse, a metaphor for how the dark underbelly of his empire had finally invaded and consumed the very heart of his domestic life. The man who had built his fortune on understanding the deepest, darkest desires of others was ultimately destroyed by the most basic and universal desire of his own associates, the desire to survive and the cold calculation that his survival was incompatible with theirs. In the end, the king was killed not by a rival army, but by the quiet, efficient machinery of his own court, a machinery he himself had designed, built, and set in motion, a machinery that, once activated, could not be stopped even for its creator. The final, chilling lesson of that basement is that in the world Sam Giancana ruled, there are no retired kings, only dead ones, and the throne he left behind was not a seat of honor, but an electric chair waiting for the next occupant. A perpetual cycle of violence and betrayal that continues to this day, a dark legacy written not in history books, but in the silent, enduring language of fear. The enduring fascination with the life and death of Sam Giancana, a figure who has been dead for nearly half a century, speaks to something far deeper than a mere morbid curiosity about gangsters. It reflects a profound and persistent cultural anxiety about the nature of power, the reliability of history, and the unsettling possibility that the trajectory of our national story may have been secretly altered in ways we can never fully prove or comprehend. He has become more than a man. He is a symbol, a dark archetype who occupies a unique and terrifying space in the American imagination. He is the ghost in the machine of democracy, the living proof that the will of the people could be subverted by the will of a few men meeting in a darkened room. His alleged role in the election of John F. Kennedy fundamentally challenges one of our most cherished beliefs, that our leaders are chosen through a free and fair process. If a mob boss could deliver a critical state, then the very foundation of our political system is vulnerable to corruption of the most insidious kind. This is not a comfortable thought, and it is one that the official history naturally resists. But it is a thought that Giancana's existence makes unavoidable. He forces us to confront the idea that the polished, heroic narrative of Camelot was, from its very inception, intertwined with the gritty, brutal reality of the Chicago underworld, that the shining knight of American politics was raised to power with the help of a dark squire. This uncomfortable symbiosis between the highest and lowest levels of American society is the true heart of the Giancana mythos. Furthermore, his deep involvement with the CIA in the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro shatters the myth of the state as a monolithic entity of pure law and order. It reveals the state as a pragmatic, often immoral, organism capable of making Faustian bargains in the name of national security. The image of CIA technicians carefully poisoning cigars alongside a man like Giancana, who ruled through fear and murder, is a powerful and dissonant one. It blurs the lines between patriot and criminal, between defender of the state and enemy of the state. In this shadowy realm, Giancana was not an outsider. He was a contractor, a specialist brought in for a specific, deniable job. This collaboration suggests that the American government, in its fight against communism, was willing to become what it sought to destroy, employing the methods of the underworld to achieve its geopolitical goals. This moral compromise has had long-lasting consequences, eroding public trust and fueling the very conspiracy theories that now surround events like the Kennedy assassination. Giancana is a central node in this web of suspicion. His motive, his means, and his connections make him a perfect candidate for the role of master conspirator. And while conclusive proof may never emerge, the circumstantial case is compelling enough to sustain a parallel history, an alternative narrative that runs like a dark river beneath the official story. This is his ultimate legacy. He is a walking question mark, placed next to some of the most pivotal events of the 20th century. He represents the what if and the maybe that haunts our national consciousness. He is the reason why, decades later, we still scrutinize the Zapruder film, still debate the magic bullet, and still wonder about the hidden connections that might explain the tragedy in Dallas. His life is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition without ethics, but it is also a warning about the fragility of truth in a world where power operates in the shadows. The story of Sam Giancana is not just the story of a gangster. It is the story of America's shadow self, a reflection of our own deep-seated fears that the game is rigged, that the truth is hidden, and that the men who really shape our world are not the ones we elect, but the ones we never see, the quiet men in the back booth, the kings of an invisible empire, whose whispers can change the course of history and whose secrets are buried with them in a silence as deep and as final as the grave. Beyond the visceral drama of mob hits and political conspiracies, the life of Sam Giancana serves as a poignant and tragic marker for the end of an era, the final violent gasp of a particular kind of American underworld that was as brutal as it was strangely predictable. A world with its own rigid codes and perverse sense of honor that would soon be swept away by the chaotic tides of modern crime, leaving behind only the ghost of a more structured, though no less vicious, past. The Chicago outfit that Giancana inherited and refined was a corporate entity, a dark mirror of the legitimate business world with a clear chain of command, territorial agreements with other crime families, and a long-term strategic vision that focused on infiltrating the economy rather than simply dominating the streets. This was the era of the gentleman gangster, or at least the illusion of one, where bosses wore tailored suits, lived in suburban homes, and sought a veneer of respectability, even as their fortunes were built on a foundation of extortion, murder, and human misery. Giancana was perhaps the last great emperor of this model, a CEO of crime who understood that real power lay in controlling unions, laundering money through legitimate businesses, and influencing politicians. His downfall, precipitated by his venture into the dangerous waters of national politics, signaled the beginning of the end for this old order. The Kennedy betrayal and the subsequent relentless pressure from the federal government demonstrated that the unwritten rules were changing, that the delicate, often symbiotic relationship between the mob and the political establishment was fracturing. The new generation of criminals that emerged in the wake of his demise lacked his discipline, his patience, and his strategic foresight. The drug trade, which Giancana and the old guard had largely avoided as too risky and too morally corrosive to their own organizations, would soon become the dominant engine of the underworld, bringing with it a level of violence and unpredictability that made the old school mob look almost civilized by comparison. The Code of Omerta, which Giancana enforced with an iron fist, began to crumble as the stakes grew higher and the government's tools, like the Right Show Act, became more powerful. The Witness Protection Program created a new class of informants, men who would have been unthinkable in Giancana's prime, who traded their silence for their freedom, further eroding the foundations of the world he had built. His death, therefore, was not just the death of a man. It was the death of a certain mythology of the mob, the end of the idea that a gangster could operate as a shadowy executive, insulated from the bloodshed he ordered. His murder in his own basement by someone he knew was a stark, brutal repudiation of the very concept of honor among thieves that he had supposedly embodied. The world that followed was messier, more fragmented, and in many ways more dangerous. The centralized, corporate-style crime syndicate gave way to decentralized, fluid networks of gangs and cartels, whose violence was more public and more random. Giancana's legacy, then, is also one of nostalgia for a darker, but perhaps more understandable time. He represents a lost era where the lines, however faint, were still drawn, where power had a face and a name, even if that face was hidden in shadow, and that name was spoken only in whispers. His story is the closing chapter of a specific volume of American history, a volume that chronicled the rise of organized crime as a parallel power structure, a volume that ended not with a triumphant climax, but with the sound of 7 soft gunshots in a quiet suburban basement, a sound that echoed not just through the halls of the outfit, but through the annals of history itself, signaling the passing of a king and the chaotic, violent dissolution of the kingdom he had spent his entire life building, a kingdom that, for all its horrors, operated with a chilling, brutal logic that the world that replaced it would utterly lack, leaving us to wonder, in some strange way, if the devil we knew was not, in fact, preferable to the legion of devils that emerged from the shadows he left behind. The true, enduring power of Sam Giancana's story lies not in the confirmed facts, the court transcripts, or the meticulously compiled FBI files, but in the vast and shadowy realm of the unproven, the whispered allegations, the tantalizing connections that forever hover just beyond the reach of definitive evidence, creating a historical phantom that is in many ways more powerful and more influential than the actual man ever was. He has become a permanent resident in the haunted house of American history, a ghost we cannot exorcise because he represents our collective suspicion that the official story is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, a deliberate fabrication. His life is a canvas upon which we have projected our deepest anxieties about the fragility of our democracy, the corruption of our institutions, and the hidden forces that truly govern our lives. Every new book, every documentary, every declassified document that fails to provide a final, satisfying answer to the questions surrounding him only serves to strengthen his mythic stature. He is the ultimate. What if? What if he really did fix the 1960 election? What if he really was the key to unlocking the truth about the Kennedy assassination? These are not just questions about a dead gangster. They are questions about the very soul of America in the 20th century. They force us to confront the possibility that our national narrative is a carefully constructed illusion, a comforting story we tell ourselves to avoid facing a much more complex and terrifying reality. This is why his story possesses such remarkable longevity. He is not remembered for the countless, anonymous victims of his juice loans or his brutal enforcement tactics. He is remembered for his proximity to power, for his role in the grand Shakespearean drama of the Kennedy era. His name is forever linked with Camelot, the bright and shining moment in American politics, creating a dissonance that we find endlessly fascinating. How could something so beautiful and so hopeful be connected to something so ugly and so corrupt? This paradox is the engine of his legend. It is the same reason we are drawn to stories of fallen angels. The greater the height, the more dramatic the fall. Giancana's fall was not just personal. It was symbolic of a national loss of innocence, a moment when the idealism of the early 1960s collided with the brutal realities of power and was shattered. His murder, coming just as he was being forced to testify about those dark days, was the final, brutal punctuation mark on that era, a stark message that the secrets of that time were not meant to be told. The silence that followed his death was not empty. It was a resonant silence, filled with meaning and menace. It told us that there were people, both in the underworld and in the halls of power, for whom the full truth was an existential threat. And so, Sam Giancana, the man was transformed into Sam Giancana, the idea that history is written by the winners, but lived by everyone else, and that the true story of power is often written in a language of whispers, winks, and unspoken agreements, a language that dies with the men who speak it. He is a permanent question mark in our national story, a reminder that for all our technology and our archives and our investigative journalism, the past is not a fixed country, but a shifting landscape where truth and legend are forever intertwined, and where the most important answers are often the ones that remain forever just beyond our grasp, lingering in the silence of a Chicago basement, waiting for a knock on the door that will never come, a truth that will never be spoken, a ghost that will never be laid to rest. As we reach the concluding notes of this dark symphony, the life and legacy of Sam Giancana ultimately coalesce into a single, haunting lesson about the inescapable gravity of a life lived in the pursuit of shadow power, a lesson that echoes from the tenements of Little Italy to the marbled corridors of Washington, a warning that the pursuit of influence through fear and corruption inevitably forges a cage from which there is no release, not in wealth, not in exile, not even in death. Giancana's entire existence was a monumental effort to control his own destiny and the destinies of those around him, to bend the world to his will through a combination of shrewd intelligence and overwhelming terror. And yet, in the final analysis, he was a man who possessed less actual freedom than the most humble of his victims. The ordinary citizen could walk down the street without a bodyguard, could speak his mind without fear of a wiretap, could trust his friends without suspecting a hidden dagger. Giancana, for all his millions and his fearsome reputation, could do none of these things. His every moment was circumscribed by the consequences of his own choices. The power he accumulated was not liberation. It was a life sentence of constant vigilance and profound isolation. This is the central, tragic irony of his story. He sought to build an empire of control, only to become the most controlled person within it, a prisoner of his own creation. His foray into the realm of national politics, which he undoubtedly saw as the apex of his influence, was in fact the catalyst for his ruin, because it introduced him to a level of power where the rules were even more ruthless and the stakes were existential. He believed he was playing the same game, just on a larger board, but he failed to recognize that he had moved from a world of criminal transactions to a world of geopolitical imperatives, where allies were even more temporary and betrayals were even more absolute. The Kennedy Alliance, which promised the ultimate validation of his power, instead exposed its fundamental limitations. He could deliver Chicago, but he could not control the conscience of an attorney general. He could conspire with the CIA, but he could not dictate the outcomes of history. He was a tool, and when he became a liability, he was discarded with the same cold pragmatism with which he himself had eliminated so many others. His death was not a random act of violence. It was the logical, almost mathematical conclusion of the equations of power he had spent his life writing. The 7 bullets were the final calculation, the sum total of a life of debt and betrayal. And in the decades since, his legacy has been contested and reshaped, but it has never been cleansed. He remains a figure of dark fascination, not because we admire him, but because his story forces us to look into a mirror and ask uncomfortable questions about our own society. He forces us to acknowledge the hidden connections between wealth, politics, and violence. He forces us to question the official narratives of our history. He is the ghost at the banquet of American exceptionalism, a reminder that for all our ideals, our nation has always had a shadow history, a parallel narrative of corruption and compromise that runs just beneath the surface of the one we celebrate. The story of Sam Giancana is, therefore, not just a true crime saga. It is a moral and philosophical inquiry into the nature of power itself. It asks us what we are willing to sacrifice for influence and what we ultimately gain from it. It demonstrates that a life built on the suffering of others is a life built on quicksand, destined to be swallowed by the very darkness it sought to command. His memory endures as a cautionary tale, a monument to the futility of seeking meaning in domination and purpose in fear. He sought to be a king, but he died a sacrifice on the altar of the very forces he thought he could master, a final, poignant testament to the fact that the only true and lasting power is not the power over others, but the power over oneself, a power that Sam Giancana, for all his cunning and all his might, never managed to attain, leaving behind not a kingdom, but a warning, etched not in stone, but in the silent, enduring memory of a nation still grappling with the shadows of its own past. If the story of Sam Giancana were merely a chronicle of criminal enterprise, it would have long since faded into the dusty archives of true crime, a footnote in the history of Chicago's underworld. But its enduring power, its ability to captivate and horrify us decades later stems from the fact that it is far more than that. It is a profound and unsettling allegory for the American condition itself, a dark mirror held up to our national soul that reflects back the tangled roots of ambition, power, and violence that lie just beneath the polished surface of the American dream. Giancana was, in his own twisted way, a hyper-realized version of the self-made man, a figure who took the core tenets of capitalism, competition, expansion, the elimination of rivals, the pursuit of profit above all else, and applied them with a terrifying, logical consistency to a forbidden domain. He was the ultimate entrepreneur in the economy of sin. And his staggering success forces us to ask where the line truly lies between the ruthless industrialist who crushes unions and the mob boss who controls them, between the corrupt politician who sells favors and the gangster who buys them. His life exposes the uncomfortable continuum that can exist between legitimate and illegitimate power, suggesting that they are not separate worlds, but rather points on the same spectrum, often sharing the same methods and motivated by the same hungers. His collaboration with the CIA further shatters any simplistic moral framework, revealing the state itself as a complex and often a moral actor, willing to make bargains with the devil in the name of a higher cause, a practice that inevitably corrupts the cause itself. This is the deeper tragedy of Giancana, the tragedy that elevates his story from a gangster tale to a Shakespearean drama of national proportions. He was not an external threat to the system. He was at times a part of its hidden machinery. He was both the disease and, in the twisted logic of the Cold War, a perceived cure. This duality is what makes his story so persistently relevant. In an age of renewed conspiracy thinking and deep distrust of institutions, Giancana stands as a historical precedent, a real, life example of the kind of shadowy cabals and unholy alliances that we now often imagine lurking behind every major event. He is the proof that our paranoia is not entirely unfounded, that the world of secret deals and hidden agendas is not a fantasy, but a part of our history. His life validates our deepest suspicions about how power really works, and in doing so, it challenges the very foundation of our national self-image. We like to believe in a nation of laws, of transparent processes, of a government of, by, and for the people. Sam Giancana's story whispers a different, more cynical truth, that it is also a nation of backroom deals, of unaccountable power, of secrets that are kept forever in the name of a stability that is often just another word for control. His violent death, unsolved and likely unsolvable, is the perfect, bleak ending for such a story. It is not a resolution, but a perpetuation of the mystery. It ensures that he remains forever in the realm of question marks, a symbol of the truths we can never fully know. The silence that swallowed his death is the same silence that surrounds the darkest chapters of our past, a silence maintained by a combination of fear, complicity, and a collective, perhaps willful, desire not to look too closely into the abyss. To remember Sam Giancana is to remember that abyss, to acknowledge that for all our progress and our prosperity, there is a part of our history that remains stubbornly terrifyingly opaque, a labyrinth of shadows from which no one, not even the king of the underworld, ever truly escapes. His legacy is the silence, the question, the lingering doubt. It is the ghost in the machine of American history, a permanent reminder that the price of the power he sought, and that we as a nation so often celebrate, is a debt that is ultimately paid in the currency of the soul, a currency that Sam Giancana, and perhaps America itself, spent in prodigious and ultimately catastrophic quantities. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, having traversed the brutal and labyrinthine path of Sam Giancana's life, from the gritty streets of his youth to the opulent halls of power he secretly influenced, and finally to the cold, stark reality of that basement floor, a journey that has revealed not just the story of one man, but the shadow history of a nation, a narrative woven with threads of ambition, corruption, and violence that challenge the very foundations of our understanding of American power. We have witnessed the rise of a criminal mastermind who built an empire on fear, the audacious alliance with intelligence agencies that blurred the lines between national security and organized crime, the profound betrayal that ignited an unquenchable fury, and the unsolved murder that serves as a permanent, silent testament to the secrets he carried to his grave. This story, pieced together from countless sources and presented to you with the sole intention of unveiling the complex truth, is more than a historical account. It is a cautionary tale of timeless resonance, a stark reminder of the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition and the perilous consequences that arise when the instruments of justice willingly collaborate with the architects of injustice. The echoes of Giancana's world are still with us today, in the whispers of political corruption, in the public's deep-seated distrust of institutions, and in the enduring fascination with the hidden forces that shape our world. His life forces us to look beyond the polished surface of history and confront the unsettling, often terrifying, realities that lie beneath. It compels us to be more critical, more questioning, and more vigilant in our pursuit of the truth. The greatest honor we can pay to the past, with all its darkness and complexity, is to seek its lessons with clear eyes and an unwavering commitment to understanding. If this deep dive into one of the most enigmatic and powerful figures of the 20th century has captivated you, if it has made you question the official narratives and ponder the hidden connections that bind power and crime, then our mission has been accomplished. The pursuit of truth is a collective endeavor. Therefore, we urge you to become an active part of this journey of discovery. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of history. Your engagement is what allows us to continue unearthing these vital stories. Now, we turn to you. The story of Sam Giancana is filled with unanswered questions and compelling theories. What do you believe is the most significant unanswered question surrounding his life and death? Do you think we will ever know the full truth about his involvement with the CIA or the Kennedy assassination? Share your thoughts your insights, and your own theories in the comments below. Let's continue this crucial conversation together. The search for truth does not end when the video does. It begins in the dialogue we create. Thank you for listening, for questioning, and for joining us on this profound journey into the heart of American darkness.